Hello friends, welcome to EPG Pathshala. Myself Partho Protim Bora from Department of Sociology, Dibrugarh University, Assam. Today in this module we will be discussing neo-Marxist perspective with special emphasis on the work of Antonio Gramsci of the paper Contemporary Social Theory. The basic objective of this module is to highlight the various cultural as well as political writings of Antonio Gramsci. In this context, we will be basically focusing on the work of civil society, his work on hegemony, the role of intellectual in the society, as well as the influence that the America have on the European society that was understood by Gramsci by the term Americanism as well as Fordism. Antonio Gramsci, he was born in Italy and he was known for his work, basically that is the writing that was associated with the politics and culture. As we know, he wanted to see the role of intermediate sphere, that is the role of civil society and various institutions. What role does the civil society and the various institutions play in the society and how they influence the ruling class. So this important aspect, the role of the civil society, how it play an important role, as well as the role of the hegemony, how it play an important role in the preservation of the ruling class. Gramsci was known for the work on hegemony, and thereby he see how hegemony as well as counter hegemony also play an important role for a progressive, that is, as he argued, for a progressive or the socialist society. The Gramsci's work can be broadly categorized as neo-Marxist because he tried to have interpretation of the society as well as politics as well as culture on the basis of basic framework of Marxian assumption. So as a result, because of the influence of the Marx work in the understanding that was given by Gramsci, he was known as neo-Marxist. The module will be basically focusing on the important work of Antonio Gramsci, that was the prison notebooks, which was basically written in the period from 1929 to 1935. It will be divided into 5 parts. It will consist of civil society, hegemony, role of intellectual, crisis, and the last part will be Americanism and Fordism. Gramsci borrows the term of civil society from the Marx work, that is the Marx differentiation between the base and the superstructure, which Marx used to understand the class relation in the capitalist society. On the other hand, the nature of understanding that was given by the Gramsci, although that was influenced by the Marx work, that is the base superstructure model, or how the economic have an influence on the ideology of the state, but Gramscian understanding substantially different from the Marx understanding. It is because Gramsci, while talking about the civil society, he was basically focusing on the intermediate sphere. That is, the intermediate sphere is the civil society, which is the intermediate between the state as well as between the private domain. So in that context, we can say that rather than the understanding of the base superstructure model, there is a somewhat different understanding of the Gramsci in the context of civil society, and that was the intermediate sphere of civil society that was given emphasis by the Gramsci. Antonio Gramsci argued that the civil society, because it exists in the intermediate sphere, as he said that because the civil society exists in the intermediate sphere, it can include various institutions. So he talked about the institution of religion, like Catholic Church, or the political, there can be in the context of political, there can be institutions like trade union or the political parties which work as a civil society. In the cultural context, he talked about literature, art and mass media which work as an institution of civil society. Again, in the context of society, he talked about the family, and in everyday activities he talked about how the membership of club, they can work as an institution of civil society. So basically the civil society includes these different kind of institutions which are located in the intermediate sphere. Gramsci argues that it is basically the civil society where the ideas that govern the society are created. So in that context, we can say that because within the sphere of civil society the ideas are created, it is not the kind of emphasis on the base or the economic base of the Marx, but rather the ideas that is the part of the superstructure. So rather than the economic base, what he see, the source of the civil society, unlike Marx, is that of the superstructure. So it is the context of superstructure where the ideology is located, and that is how we can differentiate the work of Marx and that of Gramsci. While talking about civil society, Gramsci also made a distinction between political society and the civil society. So in the context of political society, he basically talked about the domain that can be located in the hegemony of state or the political apparatus. So we know that state also have an influence by its hegemony, and that hegemony is basically manifested in terms of state apparatus, and that it was understood by Gramsci as political society. On the other hand, he said that civil society is different from the political society because in context of civil society, the power is located in the more invisible form. So more invisible form means in the context of institution of education, culture, religion, etc. So as a result, because they are located in these institutions, as a result he said that civil society is different from that of political society, which is located in the domain of state. He further says that civil society as a sphere of practice is both at the ideological level as well as at the cultural level, and as such it also helps, or on the other hand, because it located at both ideological and the cultural level, it also is associated with the state coercive nature, and how the state coercive nature is negotiated by the civil society. So we know that state or the political society play a coercive role, and that coercive role is negotiated by the civil society because of the practices of the civil society that are present within the broader domain of ideological level or in the cultural superstructure. While talking about the location of civil society, as I already mentioned, civil society is basically present in the intermediate sphere. So in that context, Gramsci wanted to see how the civil society maintain hegemony in the society, and he said that Gramsci argues that in order to maintain hegemony by the civil society, working class uses the intermediate sphere to use to build a solid foundation for the value, ideas, aspiration that is created by the socialist state. In that context, he also talked about the national popular, the idea of national popular, whereby he argues that the both opera and the folklore can be the two important way of constructing the national popular. So he said that it is a situation where the culture of the North and South Italy can come together without putting an imposition over one another. So it is basically the national popular that is created in the sphere of folklore as well as opera, whereby the culture of the both North as well as the culture of the both South Italy can come together to create a national popular culture where there is no one culture dominate over the other, or no one culture put an imposition over the other. So in that context, he basically talked about the culture of the North and the culture of the South in the context of Italy. Here, neither the culture of the North is seen as superior or inferior, or nor the culture of the South is seen as superior or inferior. And this is, as Gramsci argued, is important to create national popular in the context of civil society. So Gramsci said that in the context of creation of national popular, there is no kind of imposition of one over the another. But what is another important factor that we need to keep in mind is Gramsci also said in the creation of national popular, each one, that is each culture, whether it is the culture of North or culture of the South, maintain their own distinctiveness. And he said that this distinctiveness of the culture helped in the successful nation building in the context of Italy. So if we see summarize the idea of civil society as understood by Gramsci, we see that it is basically the political or the cultural hegemony of the one class over the society. So this hegemony can be either achieved by means of force, as we already seen in the context of political society, or it can be achieved by the means of consent, as we see in the context of civil society. So where the consent is achieved by the means of church, education system and press. So using the example of Italian government in the context of educational system by his work The Southern Question that was published in 1923, he saw how the ruling class can perpetuate the policies in favor of them by indoctrinating or thereby obtaining the consent of the masses. So in that context, or by his work on the Italian education system, he shows that there is a possibility, or on the other hand, the ruling classes can help to take away the ideology of the masses, or they can use the indoctrinate the ideology of the masses in their favor, so thereby achieving their consent. But he also lamented, said that there is a lack of development of popular culture in Italy which can be shared both by elite as well as masses. So what Gramsci said, or he was basically sorry for the fact that there is no development of a particular popular culture in Italy that can be shared both by elite as well as masses. So this was the basic concept of civil society as it was developed by Antonio Gramsci. So next we will be discussing, the next topic we will be discussing the concept of hegemony. Gramsci's interest in the concept of hegemony basically comes because of the rise of fascism in Italy, as well as because of the failure of the working class movement in Europe. So this was a particular context. So on the one hand, the rise of fascism in Italy, on the other hand, the failure of the working class movement in Europe, that created interest on Gramsci to look into the concept of hegemony, or the idea of hegemony. According to Gramsci, any struggle for progressive society must involve not just armed forces, but the ideas and ideology which guide the struggle. And in that context, he basically talk about the importance of culture and ideology, which is which are used to bring the consent of the masses. So in that context, he said how the culture as well as ideology bring the consent of the masses not by the force, or not by the coercion, but rather by consent. So that is important in the context of understanding hegemony by Gramsci. So he said that to provide or to get the consent of the masses, there is need of intellectual as well as moral leadership. So he said how the aspiration or the need or the worldview of the working class in the revolutionary struggle can be brought with the help of moral or intellectual leadership. So in order to have the various worldview or the aspiration of the working class, intellectual or the moral leadership do play an important role. And Gramsci said that it is by means of ideological indoctrination the bourgeois ruling class gain hegemony over the other. They attain hegemony because they were on the one hand economically powerful, and secondly the institution of civil society also helped to convince the people that the intellectual and the moral leadership are proper. So because of that, he said that the ruling class or the bourgeois ruling class have hegemony over the other. So the process of how the bourgeois ruling class have the ideological indoctrination. So as I already mentioned, Gramsci said that it is by means of two ways. One, because they have the control over the economy. On the other hand, they are economically powerful. Secondly, because they also have the control over the institution of civil society, and by which they convince the people that intellectual as well as the moral leadership are proper. To come out of ideological indoctrination of the ruling class, Gramsci said that working classes need to maintain a alliance. So in order to come out of that indoctrination that is done by the ruling class, Gramsci talk about how the working class need to maintain a alliance, and that alliance with the subordinate class in order to defeat the bourgeois state. So that alliance that is created by the working class with the subordinate classes will help in the overthrow or the defeat of the bourgeois state. He said that it is because of their alliance, or it will basically help in the defeat of the fascist state as well. So for Gramsci, hegemony is not exclusive for the bourgeois. It can be also adopted as a strategy by the industrial class as well. So by incorporating the interests of the other allies within the dominated group. So it is not like that hegemony as a concept or as a way is basically associated only with the bourgeois class. It can also become the part of the or strategy of the industrial working class when it will use for the creating interest within their group or within their dominated groups. Gramsci also talked about how the hegemonic group led to the other dominated group in a struggle for a socialist struggle through consensus. So he said that it can impose the aspiration on the opposite classes or the antagonistic group. To do this, it may do consensus. Gramsci said that it can do this by liquidating the other groups that can be there or other opposing group. And he said that even necessary, in such context, they may even use the armed force. So hegemonic leadership, we can see that hegemonic leadership is associated or is basically combination of both coercion as well as consent. While consent is obtained in the sphere of civil society, it is a sphere of political society which exercises the coercion. Gramsci said that political society consists of basically the legal and the political machinery of the state through which the rule of the law is imposed in the society. And this sphere will work when there is no consent on a certain issue. So if there is no consent on certain issue, the political society will impose by the various machinery of the state. Gramsci distinguished between the two types of hegemony. One is limited hegemony and second one is expansive hegemony. And expansive hegemony is one where the people spontaneously give consent to the hegemonic bloc. So if people give consent to the hegemonic bloc on their own, or if they give consent to the hegemonic bloc spontaneously, it was known as expansive hegemony. On the other hand, limited hegemony is that hegemony where hegemony bloc dominate the dissenting voice through the coercion and obtain consent by force. So on the other hand, in case of limited hegemony, the hegemony is obtained by means of force, or the hegemony or the coercion is obtained by means of force. Next important topic we will be discussing is the role of intellectual. So intellectual in the Gramscian understanding basically refer to the manner in which the relation in the society are structured, whether certain activities are categorized as intellectual. On the other hand, the certain activities are categorized as practical knowledge. So the structured relation in the society which led to the division of the activity in the society into two types. One is practical and second is intellectual. Again, in the context of intellectual, Gramsci made a distinction between the organic intellectual and the traditional intellectual. And he said that it is basically among the engineers or among the industrial technicians. He saw the potential of the rise of the intellectual group that will lead to the labor movement. And he said that according to Gramsci, this group consists of organic intellectual. The traditional intellectual are those group of people who do not maintain any relation to the society. So while the organic intellectual that can become the part of the labor movement, on the other hand they play an important role in the society, the traditional intellectual do not maintain any relation with the society or the social life. Say for example, he gave the example of traditional intellectual like that of writers, various philosophers, artists, etc. So he said that these traditional intellectuals perform their work autonomous of the political sphere. On the other hand, they do not take part in the political activities. Gramsci also but on the other hand, interestingly, Gramsci did not make any distinction between the intellectual activity and the physical activity, because according to Gramsci, even the physical activity involves brain. So he said that there is, or we should not maintain the distinction between the physical activity or intellectual activity. While talking about how the enforcement of difference between the physical activity and intellectual activity by the bourgeois state, he basically talked about the question of education. So it is basically the educational policy. Gramsci argued that the weaker section of the, or economically weaker section, are maintained in the society. Say for example, what Gramsci said, when the economically weaker section of the society are told to have the vocational education in order to become economically dominant, it is also help in the continuation of the weaker position. So although by means of vocational training, it help in the continuation, or it help in the increase of their economic position, but it actually help in the continuation of their lower position in the society. And Gramsci said that in case of progressive society, there is a constant dialogue between the intellectual and the masses. So the constant or the continuous dialogue that can take place among the intellectual and the masses is one of the important characteristics of progressive society. Another interesting concept that Gramsci gave is a concept of crisis. He said that generally what happened, the process of working class obtain consent by means of various process, or which is basically the part of progressive society. So it is basically a peaceful process, but it is not like that the obtaining hegemony will always become peaceful process. There can be also time, there will be dissent against the intellectual as well as moral leadership of the dominant group. And what the Gramsci said, when there is a opposition or when there is a dissent against the intellectual or the moral leadership, it is a stage of crisis, and it can be like detrimental, or it can have a detrimental effect on the leadership in the society. So who stays in the power of the state. Another important concept that we need to study with reference to the Gramsci's work is the idea of passive revolution. So he said that a crisis which can take place in the society regarding the power of the ruling class, or when they do not or is not successful to have hegemony, then we can see the hegemony is limited. On the other hand, when the hegemony is limited, when the hegemony is obtained by that of force. So Gramsci gave the idea of passive revolution, where the ruling class does not enjoy the genuine consent of the leadership, make itself vulnerable to the crisis. So when the ruling class do not have the genuine consent of the leadership, it led to the crisis, or there is a possibility of crisis, and this is known as passive revolution in the Gramscian term. The last important concept that we will be discussing with reference to the work of Gramsci is the idea of Americanism and Fordism. So Gramsci tried to understand the influence of America in the European society with this important concept. So he said that how the American economy or the domination of American economy was influencing the European society by the means of Americanism and by means of Fordism. He said that it is basically because they have the influence over the economy, it is basically structuring the nature of society or structuring the nature of social relationship across the globe. So how the changes that were taking place at the superstructure level can have an influence at the other level. So in this module, we discuss some of the important concepts that were associated with the Antonio Gramsci, the concept of civil society, the concept of hegemony, the concept of Americanism and Fordism, as well as the concept of role of the intellectual. So his understanding, so how the idea of civil society that is worked as an intermediate sphere, how the civil society or the political society are different, how it is basically the civil society that maintain the hegemony by consent, on the other hand political society by the force. On the other hand, we also talk about the role of intellectual, how the intellectual role is different from that of the traditional intellectual role, how the organic intellectual play an important role in the social life, but traditional intellectual like writer, artist, etc. remain away from the social life. Again, at the last part, we basically talked about the Americanism and Fordism as a new way of economic activity, or the new economic activity was influencing the social structure that was having a large impact not only in the American society, but that was transcending beyond the American society. So this understanding, as I already mentioned, these were given in his dominant or one of the classic work, that is the Prison Notebooks. So the further readings of that original book along with the various commentaries that were written on Gramsci will help you to know more detail about the work of Gramsci as a neo-Marxist. So to have an understanding in the contemporary society, his work will continue to influence in the various parts of the globe. Thank you.